Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. In this episode, we're going to look at another bit of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So last week, we had a bit of an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we talked about one specific document that talks a bit about a messianic figure and gives us some kind of flavor and idea for what a different community, other than the Christian community or other Jewish communities in the ancient world that we're maybe a bit more familiar with, it gives us an idea of what they might have expected from a Messiah. So it's a bit of a rundown of the Dead Sea Scrolls again, just to refresh our memories. The Dead Sea Scrolls are an incredibly significant archaeological discovery, discovered in around the 20th century in around the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves, and they were really well preserved documents. Most of them are pre-existing Hebrew copies of the Old Testament, and then a few other documents that we also have copies of from other archaeological discoveries. And then there was a significant portion that were also unique documents, completely new things that we had never read before. A lot of the documents are written in Hebrew, and so part of their significance is there are a lot of copies of the Old Testament in Hebrew that we didn't have before. The latest or the earliest copies of any Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament we had before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered was around the 10th century, 9th to 10th century. So we jumped back literally 1,000 years in what we had in terms of Hebrew manuscripts just with this discovery. So it's an incredible historical and archaeological treasure trove. It gives us a huge glimpse into a sectarian community of Jews who were living sort of apart from society in an area called Qumran around the Dead Sea. And they had sort of extracted themselves from normal society and were living in a way to sort of restore the nation of Israel and to live a new community sort of way. And we'll talk about that later on with the third document we'll talk about today. But these are significant for our historical understanding of ancient Jewish communities, especially around the time of Jesus, because they are written mostly around the same time, maybe a century or a bit before Jesus is born, but all around that same time. So it's all the same kind of social circumstances and political circumstances that are around at the time that the New Testament is being born. So it's hugely interesting, hugely exciting, and gives us a lot of insight. So last week we talked again about this document that describes a bit of a Messiah and how they're going to go to war and win a war on behalf of God and on behalf of God's people. Today I want to talk about three other documents, and I'll go shortest to longest here, that are very significant for understanding the idea of a Messiah and the idea of how community and how Israel is going to function in the ancient world and how those things were perceived. So the first document is a really short fragment that's often called the War of the Messiah. And this is a small little text which could be the conclusion or part of the scroll that we're going to talk about next, or it could be something on its own. But it's been reconstructed as best as possible, and I'll read kind of a bit of the reconstruction, and you can hear some things I think you'll recognize. So there's a quote from what they say is Isaiah the prophet. The thickets of the forest will be cut down with an axe, and Lebanon by a majestic one will fall. And there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, the branch of David, and they will enter into judgment with something kind of lost, and the prince of the congregation, which is a term in the Dead Sea Scrolls often used for the Messiah. The prince of the congregation, the branch of David, will kill him by strokes and by wounds, and a priest of renown will command the slain. And it goes on to talk about the kind of enemies that are typical in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A stump of Jesse, the branch of David. These are the same kinds of ideas coming out of the Old Testament that are also part of the Christian understanding of who the Messiah would be fulfilled in Jesus. But here as well, it is still a military conqueror Messiah. This idea that the prince of the congregation, as they call it, or the Messiah, the branch of David, would come and sort of wage war. The second document, which again, that little fragment could be a bit of a conclusion to, or it could stand on its own. The second document I want to talk about is called The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness. The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness. And if that title maybe rings some familiarity bells for you, a bit from the book of Revelation, a bit of other parts of the Bible, it's because it is a very similar type of idea. It is apocalyptic sort of literature, which I've talked about a bit before, which apocalypse just means revealing, a sort of uncovering, which is where we get the name Revelation from. It's just sort of a taking off the masks, if you will, if you're watching two armies wage war and it's Rome versus Israel, but you take off the mask and really it's God versus Satan. That's that kind of apocalyptic literature. So it's not necessarily predicting the future, or at least predicting the future literally as it will happen someday very far off, but it is a revelation and a lifting, a taking off the mask of real events to see a kind of spiritual or hidden reality behind them. So two armies are fighting, but it's not just two armies. It's not Rome and Israel. It's God and Satan, or it's, not just this person and that person. It's really God behind them, and it reveals a sort of spiritual reality. And so this document, The War of the Sons of Light Against the Sons of Darkness, talks about a war that goes on between the Sons of Light, who are the community that produced these documents, against the Sons of Darkness. And it's a text that at first it's talking about just a few of the tribes of Israel, the sons of Levi, the sons of Judah, and the sons of Benjamin coming together, and they're fighting against sort of historic enemies of Israel: Edom, Moab, Ammon, the Amalekites, and the Philistines. So the way the document is written is sort of setting up this army of sort of this remnant of Israel against the historic enemies in Israel. They fight this battle. And then there's a second war described where it is a war against this army, but it is a restoration of the people of Israel. It is actually all of Israel combined and brought together in order to fight this final war. And that's pretty significant because it shows us this idea that there had to be a restoration, a bringing together, sort of renewal of Israel that would also enact this sort of new age in which God would act. And that is pretty consistent with what we see in the New Testament, and also not just in the Christian community that grows up around Jesus as the Messiah, but at the time of the New Testament, we also see a similar sort of idea coming out with the Pharisees as well, being a kind of idea of restoring a proper kind of way of worship and way of following the law. And there were different ideas, and different communities had different ideas of how to do that. And so for the Qumran community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are taking it much further, and they're actually extracting themselves from society, living out a sectarian lifestyle away from the world in order to start enacting this new way of being Israel, whereas other groups of Jews were living in and among the Gentiles, if you will, and living among the rest of the world. So there are different ideas of how to live out this sort of restoration, this new Israel. And so that is sort of this apocalyptic, the war of the sons of light against the sons of darkness document. And that also relates to the largest document, and the most important one I'll talk about is called the Community Rule. And it was one of the first manuscripts found when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and therefore it's called often 1QM. And 1 is the name of the cave it's found in, so they numbered the caves out of when they found them and what order they found them in. So there's quite a lot in cave 4. Had a lot, but cave 1 is the first cave, and 1QM is the Community Rule document. And it's basically a list of rules and regulations and ways of living for this sectarian community. And there's a lot about ritual cleansing and bathing, and if you leave, what you have to do to come back, how you have to cleanse yourself, how you have to eat, all of these different rules that are some ways parallel to the law, but also in addition to. And so it's really interesting that these laws and these ways of living come up. So it's almost, in a way, it reminds me of a book I have on my shelf produced by the Iona community. That's the way of living as a member of the Iona community. There's this way that we expect a Christian to behave, but to be a member of the Iona community, there's more that you expect of yourself. And that's a similar sort of way to the way that the community rule document functions. But all three of these go together because there is this idea of a restoration of Israel and a new Israel that comes together that then God acts on behalf of. And this idea goes even back to the Old Testament with King Josiah finding the scrolls of the law and bringing it out and having it read, sort of restoring Israel to its former glory for a time and restoring the ways of the law and worshiping God and all of those sorts of things that had fallen by the wayside in favor of Gentile ways of worship or just falling away from following the law very diligently. So this idea then plays into our understanding of the New Testament and Jesus when John the Baptist comes on the scene and is living out a sectarian way of living out in the desert by himself. Some scholars have suggested that he might be an Essene, who is the kind of group I talked about, who may have been partially responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they were a sectarian Jewish group. So John the Baptist may have been one of them, or he may have just been on his own, but he is out and he's baptizing people in the Jordan, calling the nation of Israel to repentance, to a restoration of its former way of being. And if we take into consideration these documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see what John the Baptist is doing is not completely out of the ordinary. It's not completely weird, and that's why people were not going, who is that guy? What is he doing? And they were actually going out to him to be baptized, and maybe this was something that he could take advantage of, that social attitude that people did expect a sort of restoration, but maybe weren't prepared to go live an isolated way of life out in Qumran by the Dead Sea, but still wanted to be part of that restoration. And then when Jesus comes along and calls the 12 disciples, and in a way is sort of reenacting this new law on the Sermon on the Mount and restoring Israel and restoring a new 12 tribes through the 12 disciples, we again start to see these same things of themes of this idea of restoring Israel to a place in which God then acts on behalf of that Israel. The difference with Jesus, as always, is that a lot of other communities, the way they understood that was a very physical way of doing that in order to fight a war that then resulted in actual political dominance, whereas for Jesus, it is more of a restoration of the whole world and turning the world upside down, not for political or military victory, but for actually bringing the world into shalom, into peace with each other and with God, and sort of this reconciliation that then results in no longer needing the law as a way of monitoring people's behavior or making people live right, but that people live right with each other and God in shalom, in this new way of being. So you can see then how Jesus is both similar and how John the Baptist is both similar, but also different than something like the community at Qumran that were living apart from society. So there are similarities in it, and it sheds some light, and it again adds some texture to what we read in the New Testament. It doesn't take away from what we read, but it shows us that these actions of Jesus, these words of Jesus, are not happening out of nowhere, and they're not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a multifaceted, very intriguing political and social world where a lot of factors are at play and a lot of things are happening, and he is both playing into traditions and attitudes of the time while also still subverting them. So I think that's really interesting. So I think these documents, the War of the Messiah, the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, and the community rule, give us a really interesting glimpse, not just into Qumran and the community that produces the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also Jesus and the new Christian community that comes up around him there, some time after the Dead Sea Scrolls are produced. So I hope that this has been an interesting thing. I hope I haven't gone too fast through some of this. If you want to know a bit more about some of these, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least most of them, you can find them online. If you just Google them, you'll be able to find the texts. of them online, or you can find a book pretty cheaply on Amazon. The translation by a scholar called Geza Vermes is an excellent translation, and that's even like a Penguin edition, so you should be able to get a hold of a paperback of that pretty cheaply if you're curious about having a kind of thumb through the Dead Sea Scrolls. But a lot of this information is online, and so I encourage you to go and have a read and find out more about it. Or you can email me and I'll let you know some more about where I'm kind of getting some of this and how I'm talking about it. But thank you for joining us this evening, and have a great week.